and then Ordinance 11-1247, which would adopt the proposed amendment to the city code itself and would be the adopting ordinance that would effectively put the new rules into place if you choose. So the purpose of this briefing is to kind of give you some background information and familiarize with you with the topic. The current city code basically says it's unlawful to allow dogs and pot-bellied pigs to run at large. And judging from the absence of pot-bellied pigs, it must be working pretty well. So, other animals are not specifically addressed in the current code. The proposed amendment to the city code would make it unlawful to allow any animal, with the exception of cats, to run at large. In drafting the ordinance, it was determined that it's a little bit more difficult to keep leashes on cats and to prove responsibility of who owns it. The proposed ordinance would effectively close the open range within the city limits, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. As far as what is Arizona's open range law, there is no actual law by itself that defines open range. There are 9 statutes in the state laws that pertain to livestock and fences, and then when those are taken in concert with one another, they form what is commonly called open range law. And it differs by incorporated areas and unincorporated areas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about unincorporated areas first. The state law provides that property owners must fence their land to keep livestock out, except in what's called a no-fence district, and I'll explain that in a minute. So if I have property in the unincorporated area and I have a fence around it, a lawful fence which is built to certain specifications, and those are spelled out in the state statute, and an animal breaks through that fence, then the owner of the animal is responsible for damage caused by the animal. If someone kills livestock in an open range area, even if it's by accident, by striking it with, say, with a vehicle, that person is responsible to compensate the owner of the animal for damages. A no-fence district can be established in the unincorporated area by the County Board of Supervisors. And when that is done, then that area is declared a no-fence district, which basically says that a property owner doesn't have to put up a fence to protect his property from animals. It kind of takes away the open range classification, if you will, for the property in the county. But the rules are different in incorporated areas. When you get into incorporated areas, so the areas within the city limits, the rules for animals at large are what a city determines or establishes. What the city establishes what those rules are. And as I mentioned earlier, the rules for Goodyear right now are established under Chapter 7 of the City Code, and it only addresses dogs and pot-bellied pigs. It is currently not unlawful for livestock to be at large, and the state laws for fencing and damages would otherwise apply. So since we don't have rules that are different than what the commonly referred to open range laws are, those currently apply because we don't have any specific rules to the contrary. The state law does have a provision, which I just want to mention, that states that penalties related to livestock running at large shall not be enforced for 2 years after annexation of property. So let's say a property has animals at large on it and it's annexed into the city. There is a 2-year period where the penalties don't apply for those animals running at large, and then after the 2 years after annexation, then that exception goes away.
Do you mind if I ask a question at this point?
Surely.
What did we do in Mobile? Because did we do that same? Was that the 2 years? Because there was an issue on, and if you want to answer this later, you may do that.
Mayor, I can answer it right now. Since we didn't have any laws prohibiting animals at large, then the 2-year provision didn't really apply because we didn't have rules to enforce against the property.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Now, as a kind of a corollary to that, it doesn't say, the statutes don't say anything about once a property is annexed into a city and you don't have rules, it doesn't prohibit the city from enacting new rules. And it doesn't specifically put a time frame on it.
Thank you.
Now, for some additional background information, the Rainbow Valley area where most of this activity that we're going to talk about tonight is occurring has been in the city since about 1988, 1986, 1988. There were several annexations that basically took the city limits down to Patterson Road, which is the one south of Riggs. The Sonoran Valley area from Patterson Road south to Mobile was annexed in 2007. So that's the other annexation that extended our city limits down to about 4 miles south of State Route 238. And up until recently, there had not been a lot of serious problems involving animals at large. However, within the past year, the number of complaints from residents and farmers had increased, particularly in the Rainbow Valley area. And there had also been some renewed farming activity in this area. So in addition to seeing more livestock in the area, we've seen more farming get reinstituted. I think it has something to do with the price of cotton and hay. So it's encouraged them to put the property back in production. And then in the last 10 months, we've seen evidence of 10 accidents involving vehicles hitting livestock in the Rainbow Valley area. And then we had included a map in your packet, which shows, to get you oriented, Willis Road is right about here, and that's where the Rainbow Valley Water Treatment Facility is, about there on Rainbow Valley Road. And then as you go south, there's Queen Creek Road. That's where the little bridge over the Waterman Wash is. And then as you go further south, this is Riggs. That's about where the pavement ends. And then down here, another, it looks like maybe 2 miles is Patterson Road. And the accidents apparently have clustered along the Rainbow Valley Road area. Now, the proposed ordinance would apply to all property within the city limits from Camelback Road on the north to 4 miles south of State Road 238. It does not specifically require animals to be fenced in, but it does require the owner not to allow the animal to trespass on property of others. And so as a practical matter, fencing them in is probably the way to do it, but it does not specifically require fencing. It would shift the responsibility for damage caused by livestock from the property owner to the animal owner. And that's the primary difference when you think in terms of open range laws about who's responsible for what the animal does. Is in the open range, a property owner is responsible for keeping the animals out, whereas where it's not open range, then it's the responsibility of the animal owner not to have the animal trespass on other property. So that's kind of the most simplistic way to explain it. We have heard opposition to the proposed ordinance by the Arizona Cattlemen's Association. I know you've received some correspondence, and at least one of the ranchers who has the below allotment who grazes cows in the Rainbow Valley in Hidden Valley area. The grazing leases and their relationship are in another map that we included with the agenda packet. And I apologize, but we're working in terms of having distinguishing landmarks on this. We're working at a pretty large scale, so it was I could have done a better job of getting the roads identified. But this road that you see, the black line that curves at the north end, that's Rainbow Valley Road. So if you could kind of orient yourself to that road. Up in here is Estrella Mountain Ranch. Is it?
It's not showing
I'm
you.
sorry.
I'm not seeing your.
The black line.
I will. Thank you. Okay. I should have warned Eddie. The black line is this one right here. Yeah, I'm doing it with my left hand. Apparently that doesn't work as well as my right. The Estrella Mountain Ranch area is right in this area here, which is currently within the limits of the below allotment. All of this area that's in kind of a tan colored all the way down into the Mobile area is city limits. This is our State Route 238 comes across. And this is actually a separate allotment called the Conley allotment, and then north to Goodyear to the Gila River is the below allotment. And you can see the Estrella Mountains in this area here.
Can I ask you a question? Could you show me just with your pen where, because on the other one you had where the accidents occurred, could you put it in a proportion to the allotments? 'Cause it's hard to read.
Yeah, seeing it's, that's good.
I don't know, can you,
As long as you did that, are there any county islands in there that aren't annexed? Because I noticed the one on the other map where you had the dot, the last, I think it's the last one to the south. There's a line drawn around it, and I don't have it, I did, right there. Who
yeah,
does that?
that is county, right.
That's
On
county.
the west side of Rainbow Valley Road,
So,
south of Riggs, that corner is county.
so they can cross there if we passed an ordinance, that's all.
Even if we passed an ordinance, if a livestock was on that property, it'd be beyond our jurisdiction. We would have no authority to do anything.
All right, I just happened to notice that one accident happened in that.
I have a question. Is there any regulation or jurisdiction we have on BLM land?
Councilor Osborne, I'd have to defer to council on that, but I'm assuming that the BLM could claim an exemption or superior rights to the city rule or regulation. But we're not, if a person has a grazing lease on a BLM property, they're allowed, that's like owning the property and having right to let the cattle roam. It's when they get off onto the private property is where our jurisdiction would be.
But isn't that the case of one of the issues is that there's a land lease with BLM to allow grazing?
Well, it is part of the issue I think that you'll hear about more tonight, both from the ranchers and the Cattlemen Association, is that there's private property interspersed with the BLM properties, and so the only effective way to keep the cattle from going onto the private property would be to fence the property so that they would not get onto that property, and that is one of the points of contention.
And Councilman Osborne, I think this is on, but
Yeah.
I don't know now. Anyway,
Yeah.
I don't think that that would preclude us the fact that it's BLM land. Number one, the exemption that exempts a municipality or governmental entity from zoning is when they're acting in a governmental function. This would be a proprietary function. They chose to be annexed into the city. I don't remember if you remember the Amaranth. We had to annex some state land, and they had to agree to the annexation. So at that point, they subjected themselves to the jurisdiction in any kind of non-governmental function. So I don't see that as an issue. Thank you.
I have a question. The roads down there, Rainbow Valley Road, is that a city road or is that a county road?
Councilman Gelser, Rainbow Valley Road down to at least Patterson is inside the city limits.
Okay, so if a cow walked off the county land onto the city road and got hit by a car or hit a car, then the city rules would apply. Is that correct?
I presume it would apply.
Yes.
Because the cow would be in the city limits at that point.
Thank you.
Okay, just a couple more. Staff had been working on preparing an animals at large amendment to the city code because we had gotten some periodic complaints, although they hadn't really risen to a sense of urgency. But as we started getting more complaints, we re-looked at the records for accidents and found that we did have 10 within the past 10 months, and that did give us cause for concern. And we felt that that merited expediting the ordinance when that became our knowledge. If adopted, the owner of any animal at large could be subject to the criminal or civil penalties under the Article 1-8 or Chapter 18 of the City Code. In the case of farmers who are complain about livestock trespassing on the farms, they'd also be able to report a trespass by livestock to the Arizona State Department of Agriculture, and they would in turn respond as well. They would have the right, if they found that the animals were trespassing, to, if they were not immediately claimed, they could pick them up and hold them for auction, if they are not claimed after they've held them for a specific period of time. So there are enforcement rules besides just the city code available. Just to wrap up, your options tonight, obviously, you could adopt the proposed ordinance as presented with an emergency clause making it effective immediately, and that's how it has been presented to you in your agenda. You could adopt the ordinance as presented without an emergency clause, making it effective in 30 days from adoption. You could postpone adoption of the proposed ordinance to a future meeting to allow additional time to work on the issue. Or you could adopt the proposed ordinance with other changes as to its applicability or implementation time frame. So just wanted to kind of lay those out for you if they weren't obvious already. So that concludes my comments.
Thank you,
Stand
Joe.
for more
You're
questions.
going to stay right by us, so we
I'm right
any
here.
questions? All right, who would like to start this?
I have
Gary?
I have one minor thing, don't laugh about this one, but in your definition of what large animals are, I would consider that you might want to say, if you really want to exempt cats, I would say exempt household cats and not lions, tigers, cheetahs. You know, people have exotic animals. One could get loose, and then we have a discussion of, well, it's a large cat. And so, okay, fine.
No.
Moving
no.
right along.
We're moving, that's all right. We're going to make this really a good one. Yes. Sherry? Now, remember, we call each other by first names on this. This is a work session, a conversation. So go ahead, Sherry.
Okay, my question is, what do the municipalities right around us, I know Buckeye, since they border the BLM, what is their ordinance, or are we similar to that ordinance then? Are we kind of consistent, since some of the landowners with those leases look like it goes through both of us? We're pretty close.
I can answer that in a second. Councilor Loretano, Avondale has an ordinance in place for cattle, horses, mules, sheep, rodents, goats, burros, livestock, and poultry. Buckeye has one for livestock or poultry. Immediately adjacent, Surprise has one for livestock, dogs, cats, and other similar animals and fowl. Tolleson has livestock, fowl, and animal.
Okay, so our neighbors are pretty similar. It would be consistent, ours would be consistent with theirs.
I think it is. I guess, though, in fairness, not all of them have the grazing allotments immediately adjacent to them, or inside them, like we do.
Okay, that's what I was wondering with Buckeye, since if we're going to have someone who's grazing a lot, and it's adjacent, and if it's Buckeye, I'd like ours to be kind of similar to where the grazing allotments go, I guess, if that makes sense.
Councilor Loretano, I have to admit, I did not look at Buckeyes myself, so I don't have personal knowledge of what it says.
They have one.
But this summary table that Susan Rogers had done said that they did have one and it applied to livestock or poultry.
Next.
Well, I guess one of my questions, I understand that we've got a public safety issue here. I respect that, and a nuisance to some. One of my concerns was reaching out to Mobile, because I do recall that when we were going through the annexation process, that there were cattle ranchers there that had been generational cattle ranchers, and I do recall hearing from them, and that I don't know if they've had the opportunity to hear and voice their opinion, and I think they need that right. But at the same time, I also remember from that annexation time that there were people that lived in Mobile that were tired of the cows roaming around freely. So it goes both ways. But I do feel that I'd like to know if you've found who those ranchers are, if you reached out to people in our south. I mean, this is truly where, rural is hitting urban, and we need to reach out. So,
Yeah. Councilor Osborne, admittedly, the reaching out to the ranchers themselves, we had not done as probably as we had intended. When we first started drafting the ordinance, we thought we would include that, but when we found the history of the accidents, we elected to move faster, and so that has not occurred to the extent that we normally would do.
gotcha. Okay.
It seems to me, I remember when we worked on that committee on Mobile, I remember us working on some of these rules, that it was really horses, remember, in the front yard, and so we eliminated the idea they had to keep the horses out of the front yard, so they weren't roaming around. And I do remember the cattle. I do remember us discussing that, but I don't remember us making a distinct decision on how to handle that, which obviously we didn't at that time. Is that correct?
That's correct. And
Joe?
I had two other contacts by telephone from one property owner in Mobile, one property owner in the vicinity of Patterson, and both in those instances, once they understood what the proposal was, they were in favor of it.
Joe, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of you on that.
No, that's okay. I was just wondering, would now be the time? I wanted to hear a little bit about from our police officers or some of their concern from a public safety on the accidents. Would this be appropriate here, or?
Well, if I can just get some of the other questions first. I'm not sure if it's appropriate, because staff can come up. I know we can't let any of the,
It's a work session, and staff,
Staff's
if
allowed.
you have questions of staff,
Okay.
it would be
Let's
appropriate to
get
ask
finished
questions
with
of
that.
staff.
Okay. Mayor, my questions, I have several questions. When an animal is hit, since we've had these 10 accidents, who was responsible to remove the animal? At what cost?
I only know of one instance, which was the most recent, where the animal was in the road. So I believe emergency personnel pulled the animal off to the side of the road, and after it was sitting there for a couple of days and the farmer complained, we had animal control go and remove the carcass.
Okay, so that is an expense to our city, and that's something we need to be aware of.
Yeah, and I don't know what that expense is.
Okay.
We could find out, but I don't know what that actual number is.
Okay.
If it's in our road, we would have some liability if we didn't.
I'm sorry, we can't hear you. Can you speak?
I'm sorry, Councilmember Campbell, if the livestock's in our road, we'd have an obligation to remove that obstruction, because
That's right.
it creates some liability to the traveling public. But, so,
Well, we would have the liability anyway, whether we have an ordinance in or not, since
Right.
it's on our city street, and if
But
someone is killed, then the city is wide open for liability.
but we would have some legal liability for people who are injured because of it, but we'd also have no financial recourse to go against the person whose cattle trespassed as well.
Okay. My second concern is when we do, or if we do an ordinance, I want to include the word burrows. You've got livestock, and you've got large fowls, swine, a reptile, a rodent. Someone may have I don't know what you call a group of donkeys, burrows, a herd, and they may
Sounds
be
good.
loose.
Sounds right.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't know. Also, have we had injuries in these accidents? I mean, the accident itself is bad enough, but have we had injuries in these accidents that we're aware of?
It's my understanding, Councilmember Campbell, that there was an injury this last time. I don't know about the others. I don't know if the police have that information or not.
All right. Do we know, are these animals on the roadway during the day or at night, or are they just there 24/7? You could.
I
just
believe they're there
come upon them.
24/7, but I'm
I
not sure
think
what.
you can answer that
The
in a
what?
moment. I'll answer that in a moment with the conversation I had with the
Oh,
farmer.
good. Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's my concern, is if they're on the roadway at nighttime, and they're very difficult to see. And, yeah. So that's my
Well,
two
I
questions.
just happened to be at a social event on Saturday night, and who was sitting next to me? But somebody from the Buckeye area that knew the farmers and the ranchers, and he himself is what you might call a farmer. So I asked a lot of questions. So I'm just going to throw out some of these statements too that he said. First of all, he said most cattle is confined, but he said about the movement of the cattle. Cattle move through the night as well as the day.
That's what I thought, yeah.
Some cotton and alfalfa farmers use electric fences to keep the cattle out of their crops. The reason they're out there is feeding areas are more scarce at certain times of the year. Cattle are turned out to roam to feed, usually because the savings on the feed to the rancher can be up to $300 a ton for hay. Cattle tend to roam to water sources, so he assumed that there was a water source across that road. So that's my question to him tonight, if there is a water source and that's where they're going. They seem to have a tendency to bed down beside the roads. I'm assuming they're bedding down because maybe there's gullies and it's cool, you know, or maybe they don't like crossing the road, so they want to rest before they cross the road. I don't know. Didn't talk to a cattle. The other thing, people have a tendency to drive that road at high speed limits. And so what is the speed limit on that road?
50 miles an hour.
50
but
miles an hour.
It is correct that people tend to speed.
Yeah, so there's there's a tendency that we have as humans not to follow the laws. So it's sort of a disadvantage to the cow, right? And
Yeah.
to the bull. And I already asked the question about the annexed area of the road. Let me see here. My question is, how many ranchers are there? I mean, these cattle come from 2 farms, 3 farms?
Mayor, as far as I know, there's 2 allotments, grazing allotments, the Belote and the Conley. I'm not aware of others. I think my understanding is they have all the grazing rights, so I don't know if there would be anybody else out there.
So obviously there's been an increase in the last year. There's only been 1 accident for 9 years, was it? Or what was the 1 accident?
I think they'd
a
average
year?
maybe 1 a year.
1 a
is
year,
what
and
the
then all of
police
a sudden we
department
have
had
a
told me.
barrage of them. So that tells me we've even increased the number of cattle that are roaming, or we have decreased feeding them in the farmer's area, and they're sending them out to pasture. So just a comment. Yes, Joe?
No, again, I'd like to hear from the police department on some of
Okay.
their concerns as far as safety, what they're dealing with on the recent.
That's good. Is there a microphone for him to talk into, please?
Right here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Mayor, Lord, Council, thank you. I know there were some questions that were brought up earlier in reference to the actual injury crashes and what they were. The information that I do have is that there's been 10 crashes there, 2010, 2011 year up to present, and actually 2 of those 10 crashes have had injuries at them. All the rest were non-injury crashes. Those 2 crashes that did have injuries weren't life-threatening injuries, weren't serious injuries, weren't disfigurement, weren't fatals or anything like that. They were non-incapacitating injuries. So just to give you a reference, those are injuries that might go to the closest hospital, West Valley, for observation, things like that. Not so much St. Joe's where there's other trauma involved.
Thank you. Any other questions, Lisa?
Yeah, but you could kill yourself if you hit a cow if he's big enough and you're going fast enough.
Absolutely.
I mean, it is a public safety issue.
It is, and it's no different than hitting an elk when you're going through Payson, or hitting a burro when you're going down towards Tucson, because there's a lot of them down there. It is a very heavy object, and we all know that if you involve a vehicle speed and so forth, that you can kill yourself or kill the animals. Which in these cases, I believe every one of them had died in every crash, the actual animals themselves. But yes, it is a danger, depending on where that animal ends up in the hood through the windshield, and then that animal's not dead and it starts kicking, or its hooves start hitting you. It's just a matter of, depending if it hits you in the head or where, it could actually become a fatal crash very, very easily.
John?
Do you know if, in the cases of the animals dying, were the people who hit them charged with the cost of that animal?
I don't know if they were charged. That's all done through insurance companies. What happens is the officer will go out there and investigate it. He'll write up the crash, and he'll get their information just like anything else, registration, insurance, and so forth. They are labeled as vehicle number 1 at that time, and the insurance companies will then work with the ranchers or the owner of the cattle to find out what they need to do to compensate them or to figure it out. Most of them have diagrams to give a little diagram of what happened and a narrative of what the officer investigated on scene.
Thank you.
So how many we paid for as a city? Because there was no reporting.
As a city, I don't know. I know that the ones that we do have, all of them had a driver involved, vehicle involved, a separate insurance company involved, as them hitting the cow. The one that we do have that is a hit and run, we don't have any leads in that case right now, and it's inactivated. So that's the only one that we know that is out there that doesn't have a lead to it.
And do we know how many cattle we had to haul away?
At minimum 10, but I believe one of the crashes in reviewing it did have 2 cattle involved at one time. So I want to say that there was 11 cattle total in those 10.
On the hit and run that we have no leads for, did this, other than the investigative time of the officer, did the city have any other liability? Did we have to pay, did the farmer, the rancher come after the city for the value of the cow?
Councilmember Gelsler, I wouldn't know.
Okay.
I think that might be a risk management side of things. I know that we personally, the police department, know, other than our time and services and removing that animal out of the roadway if we need to.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Sherry.
I don't know if this is on or not. You brought up Payson about elk, and I know last time we were up there, my concern, I guess, with the ordinance and where I'm going to go here is that although I don't have a problem with the ordinance, I think it's well written, it seems like it's just only after the fact to determine who's liable, and I don't know if it's really going to be a preventative measure. Are there any other ways we can work with the ranchers? Because I know like in Payson they have that elk cross here and cattle guards. Is there any way they can funnel that or fencing? I don't know about ranching because it seems like this is not necessarily 100% going to solve the problem. They may still get out. And we've got the ordinance and we can say, well, now you're liable or you're at fault, but I don't know if that's going to solve it. So just any ideas?
Yeah, that's not his area of expertise.
Councilor Loretano. Well, I think I've said to others before, I don't know that I've ever seen a piece of paper stop a cow from doing what a cow is going to do. So just by passing the ordinance, obviously, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to solve the problem. Hopefully, what it would do is by shifting the responsibility, then perhaps there could be better management of the cattle to keep them away from that area where the traffic apparently and the cows have a conflict. We do have signs posted. There are other things that can be done. I mean, there can be additional fencing. There could be additional cattle guards, but then it becomes an issue of expense and who does that.
That's what I'm saying for the ranchers to do, not necessarily.
I understand what your position would likely be, but I'm just saying that those are some things that you can do, but as a practical matter, I don't know that you can put up enough fences to keep them where you want to keep them, at least with respect to the roads.
Go ahead.
Excuse me. And I believe that we put in the report that it would cost $8,000 to $12,000 per mile for fencing.
I think that's what one of the ranchers had, or the Cattlemen's Association had indicated that that's what the cost of the fence is.
So the water source that I talked about is across the road. There aren't any other water sources on that side that keeps them, I mean, that doesn't stop them from going any other farmers and eating the crops, but I'm curious about the water sources. They have to come down, cross that road to get to the water source?
Mayor Lord, I can't admit that I'm intimately familiar with where the cows are going and how they're getting where they're going.
I don't know why not.
I think you'll hear during the public testimony part of the meeting tonight
Okay.
from some that have better knowledge of that than I do. But there is, obviously, the washes when there is rain are likely candidates as to where the water is going to be for the animals. And it's likely that's where some vegetation is going to grow, that it also attracts them. But then the farmer fields do the same thing, because they irrigate the fields in order to produce the crops, and then they probably have tail water that goes somewhere too that is attractive to the animals.
Yes, Wally?
I have a couple of more questions. So are we talking about only 300 head of cattle total? Is that the max this person's supposed to have? And how do we know that's really what he has?
Councilor Campbell, the figure of 300 was what I had determined from a biological report that was done for the BLM relative to grazing. And that is the year-round number, but the report did not state the maximum number of ephemeral usage, that is periodic use that can come and go. They didn't give me a number, so I think it could be higher than that.
Okay, so, but each of these entities could have 300 each, is what I'm getting at.
I believe that the report said 300 for the Beloit and 350 for the Conley for year-round use, and then there could be additional head of cattle on an ephemeral basis, depending on, and it has to do with the weather, and if it's a moist year where there's more grass growth, then it can obviously support more cattle, and then a dry year it may not support as many. So I think that the concern is the BLM wants to maintain the integrity of the grazing area too, so that it's not overgrazed.
All right, and my last question is the loose livestock are going on other property and causing damages to those properties. Do we know how much damage they're causing, and is there any recourse for that person against the city or the person that has the grazing animals? Or I mean, is it a public nuisance here?
Some of the complaints that we have gotten from individuals who may have a house down there and have a garden planted is that the cows get in there and tear up the gardens. It's kind of hard to put a monetary value on that for a small operation. But the commercial farming, if the livestock gets in the fields, then obviously it eats the crops which they're trying to grow to produce. And so there's damages along those lines. And I don't have a dollar figure for you tonight.
Documenting that too, when we hear it?
Yes, when we hear it, we will document it. We haven't heard the precise numbers yet.
Okay, thanks.
Just a quick follow-up on what the mayor had mentioned. Apparently, the last year, there seems to be more cattle crossing and causing the issue. So I guess from my perspective is, what's driving that migration? Is it the farming, the food that's driving them? Is it the water that's driving them? Is it the fact that, the food on the other side, are they cutting back on the hay, so the grazing, they're wandering over into the farmer? Other than fencing, I'd just be curious if there's anything else that would prevent that migration and ends up getting in the farmers. Because apparently this is more recent, so the numbers are up. So if something's driving them, they're driving them over into the farmland greater than it was a year ago. So I'd be curious what that is that's driving it, and if there's anything that can be done to address that issue, in a more cost-effective manner, putting the two parties together. So just fuel for thought on that one.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Joe. I think that ends our discussion. As far as information, the councilman's report, we'll delay that to the regular meeting, and also the manager's summary. So with that, adjourn.